Welcome back to the Think, See, Listen YouTube channel, where I give it to you raw and uncut and uncensored, unedited and completely unprofessional, all to give glory to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. This is part 2 of The Great Reset and the War for the World by our Uncle Alex Jones. This is a very entertaining read so far. Been enjoying it. I'm gonna keep on going. I think I remember where I kind of left off. I'll back up a little bit and we'll get right to it. In the preface of his second book, Schwab also begins by talking about trust. The cloaked language he uses makes one wish to have been a fly on the wall among the Davos elite when Trump was elected in 2016 and the years that followed. They must have been falling over themselves, wondering whether Trump and his skepticism were the disease or simply a symptom of something much larger that threatened to undermine their plans. Public trust is business, government, the media, and even civil society has fallen to the point where more than half of the world feels the current system is failing them. The widening gap in trust between those in the country's top income quartile and the rest of the population indicates that social cohesion is fragile at best and very close to breaking down at worst. It is this precarious political and social context that we face both the opportunities and the challenges of a range of powerful emerging technologies, from artificial intelligence to biotechnologies, advanced materials to quantum computing, that will drive radical shifts in the way we live and which I have described as compromising the fourth industrial revolution. In the middle of the first Trump term, Schwab and his Davos crew must have been nervous. According to Schwab, the bottom 75% of the country thinks that the top 25% is screwing them. They understood that things were very close to falling apart, which is why he wrote, "Social cohesion is fragile at best." This isn't me talking, this is Klaus Schwab in 2018. But Schwab is nothing if not persistent. He was still pushing this fourth industrial revolution when he wrote, "We face both the opportunities and the challenges of a range of powerful emerging technologies." He's like the Catholic priest who says to the parents of his parish, "I know there's been a lot of accusations about priests being alone with kids, but I still want to take your young teenage boys away for a long ski weekend." Schwab freely admits that the elite of the world are not trusted by the vast majority of the population, but he's going to keep going. But standing at these crossroads means we bear a huge responsibility. If we miss the window of opportunity to shape new technologies in ways that promote the common good, enhance human dignity, and protect the environment, there is a good chance that the challenges we experience today will only be exacerbated as narrow interests and biased systems further entrenched inequalities and compromise the rights of people in every country. The audacity of Schwab is genuinely breathtaking. the Davos Group members are the elite 1% of the world. If there has been a problem with income inequality, human dignity, and degradation of the environment, it's the fault of the 1%. It's a little like the main suspect in a murder being the detective of a crime. That might make for an interesting movie, but always remain in the realm. It should always remain in the realm of fiction. Those who caused these problems should not be driving the solution. Schwab lets you know that his brain trust he relies on are the very people who created this mistrust among the population. This book is the product of many world-class experts from across the World Economic Forum's diverse community. Section 2 in particular synthesizes the perspectives of leading thinkers from the forum's Global Future Councils and Expert Network, where were it not for their generous contributions of time and knowledge, it would have been impossible to cover the breadth of subject matter to the depth required to make sense of the most impactful technology domains. I also very much appreciate the thoughtful and most relevant reflections provided by Satya Nadella in the foreword. These are people who don't live in your world. These are ivory tower intellectuals bought and paid for by the corporate titans who are upset that they don't yet have complete control over your world. But they don't call it corruption, they call it partnership. While he sets out much of the same argument in the introduction as he does the preface, Schwab tells you exactly what he hopes to bring about at the end of his introduction. The book closes with a vision for systems leadership, summarizing the critical governance issue that leaders from all sectors, along with the general public, must tackle together to create an inclusive, sustainable, and prosperous future. Schwab isn't inviting you to help him create a better future. He's inviting you to help him build your prison cell. In his second book, Schwab seemed to believe he had to simplify his original message so that at the end of each chapter he provided a simple 1 to 2 page summary. The first question he seeks to answer is to define the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Here's how Schwab describes it in his chapter, Framing the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The Fourth Industrial Revolution is a way of describing a set of ongoing and impending transformations in the systems that surround us and which most of us take for granted every day. While it may not feel momentous to those of us experiencing a series of small but significant adjustments in life on a daily basis, it is not a major change. The Fourth Industrial Revolution is a new chapter in human development, on par with the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. And once again, driven by the increasing availability and interaction of a set of extraordinary technologies. Confused? Schwab is telling you that the public doesn't see these momentous changes. Sure, the people notice some minor changes, but things are genuinely moving in a big way, according to Schwab. Once again, Schwab and his Davos group are just so much better at figuring out what's happening in your life than you. And Schwab doesn't want you depending on yourself to figure out these changes or any of the local or national institutions you've relied on for years. In a rhetorical sleight of hand, that done the communists proud as they established their Young Pioneer program to indoctrinate the children. Schwab reveals his plan in a section titled A New Leadership Mindset. These three challenges, distributing benefits, managing externalities, and ensuring a human-centered future, cannot be easily solved top-down through regulation or well-meaning government initiatives, nor is it at all likely that the current constellation of international and national institutions, market structures, organized and spontaneous social movements, and incentives for individuals will lead to powerful new technologies being widely available, completely free from harm and fully focused on empowering the people that use them. This should strike everybody as a shot across the bow of any person who believes in a civil and peaceful society. Schwab has no interest in typical government programs. He doesn't believe in any currently existing international or national institutions. Neither does he believe in any spontaneous social movements or individuals who rise up with good ideas, or any of the typical incentive programs that might bring about positive change. Schwab and his Davos gang are interested in wiping out every one of the previously existing social structures that have guided the development of countries and nations. I've always believed that if somebody confesses something disturbing about themselves, such as, "I've never been able to be faithful," you should pay attention. If you choose to date that person, then find your heart broken when they cheat on you, the blame should fall on you. Schwab makes it clear he intends to wipe away the power of all our institutions and structures. In the chapter summary, Schwab lays it out again. The fourth industrial revolution is a new chapter in human development, driven by the increasing availability and interaction of a set of extraordinary technologies building on three previous technological revolutions. This revolution is only in its early stages, which provides humankind with the opportunity and responsibility to shape not just the design of new technologies, but also more agile forms of governance and positive values that will fundamentally change how we live, work, and relate to each other. What are these more agile forms of governance? A summary execution by firing squad without the benefit of a trial? Maybe the continued illegal detention of January 6, 2021 protesters, many of whom languish in jails more than a year after the event, who have been denied a speedy trial. And there really isn't much discussion of what these positive values are, except for the concern that the 75% of the country mentioned before doesn't seem to trust the top 25%. Are the members of the Davos group or Charles Schwab, Klaus Schwab going to come to your house and ask, "Why don't you like me?" It's likely that Schwab's plan invokes pledging your trust to the Davos group, lest you suffer the punishments made possible by their more agile forms of governance. After all, how are they going to get you to accept these fundamental changes to how we live, work, and relate to each other? What will be done to those who object? Schwab is curiously silent on such subjects. For a long portion of his second book, Schwab spends a great deal of time talking about the interconnectedness of technology, as if we didn't realize that. The technologies of the Fourth Industrial Revolution are connected to one another in that they all require and build on digital capabilities and networks created by the Third Industrial Revolution, just as those technologies require and build on uh, just as those technologies required and built on the electricity networks of the Second Industrial Revolution. That's almost as self-evident as saying, before they could be your parents, your grandparents needed to have children. It is at such banalities that Schwab excels. In the next chapter, Schwab discusses the politics of technologies and what he calls the mistaken twin beliefs that technology drives history and that technology is value neutral. In fact, he labels both beliefs extremely dangerous. If you were looking for at least one area of life where politics didn't intrude, Schwab will give you no sanctuary. It's Schwab's belief that when any technology is created, it contains the residue of values, goals, and compromises, and the more powerful the technology, the more important it becomes to appreciate what these are. Perhaps he's right. Maybe if people understood that Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook as a way for his fellow Harvard males to rate the attractiveness of the Harvard females, we'd all resign from the platform. Zuckerberg would lose all of his money and he would end up as a homeless person sleeping on the streets of San Francisco. I understand it's a long shot, but a person can dream. One must be wary of how Schwab and his Davos group use language. I think one of the most dangerous words that should concern you is stakeholder. That is how Schwab ends the chapter titled Empowering All Stakeholders. Creating a prosperous, inclusive, and equitable fourth industrial revolution for society and citizens means being conscious of the choice we make in technology systems, which will inevitably impact economic, environmental, and social systems. This means having the courage to confront existing economic and political paradigms and reshaping them to empower individuals regardless of ethnicity, age, gender, or background. Our country was founded on the idea of individual rights. The government is supposed to protect those rights. That's called freedom. But if Schwab and company come up with a way to short-circuit those rights, that would be a powerful tool. This is the definition of stakeholder from Investopedia. A stakeholder is a party that has an interest in a company and can either affect or be affected by the business. The primary stakeholders in a typical corporation are its investors, employees, customers, and suppliers. However, with increasing attention on corporate social responsibility, the concept has been extended to include communities, governments, and trade associations. Whenever you hear the word stakeholder, you should think of it as a weapon Schwab and company will use to deprive a person of their rights. Section 2 of Schwab's second book is titled Technologies, Opportunities, and Disruption, and contains a great deal of unrelated material such as this gem. The rising importance and applicability of machine learning has created the demand for new types of customized computing architectures. Google, one of the world's largest purchasers of chips, designed large numbers of tensor processing units, application-specific, integrated circuits designed for deep learning algorithms. One might be tempted to discount the importance of such a bland paragraph, except for how it slips in the idea of deep learning algorithms. Remember all those science fiction machines you saw as a kid, where the robot went crazy, killing people, and the climax of the film was when the hero discovered it wasn't the robot that was at fault, but the psychologically deranged developer? Yeah, this is one of those kinds of problems, except that instead of the robot going on a killing spree, the algorithm will simply declare your well-reasoned policy disagreement to be hate speech, or even worse, racist. Yes, the problem is not the machine, it's the person who programmed it, which is why the radical leftists of Silicon Valley are so distrusted by the rest of America. The next section is titled The Internet of Things, and comes to the shocking conclusion that much of the world is interconnected. Another section, Cyber Risks, comes to the inspired realization that there are cyber risks involved in technology, and we should spend money to defend against these risks. Final chapters on artificial intelligence, biotechnologies, drones, advanced materials, and virtual reality are similarly unenlightening. It's only when we get to the conclusion of Schwab's second book that he starts to reveal how he and his Davos group are going to restructure society. Don't worry, he tells you. We won't just have governments or corporations coming after you. There will be other sources of pressure. Governance, however, is not just government. The formal structures we have for creating laws and regulations. Governance includes the development and use of standards, the emergence of social norms that can constrain or endorse use. Private incentive schemes, certification and oversight by professional bodies, industry agreements, and the policies that organizations apply voluntarily or by contract in their relationship with competitors, suppliers, partners, and customers. In this world that Schwab wants to create, you'll have to worry about more than just government. In truth, it doesn't seem as if Schwab has much use for government unless it does exactly what he wants. Instead, Schwab is counting on the big corporations to function as de facto governments, possibly through their terms of use, terms of service. Does it make sense how the big tech companies were able to censor conservative viewpoints in the run-up to the 2020 election? How did they do this when this violated the spirit of our First Amendment? How did these tech leaders justify it to their conscience? Possibly because they've been brainwashed by Klaus Schwab at all those Davos conferences. And did you notice how Schwab pushes the emergence of social norms? Probably by the use of his beloved conversations, which are nothing more than scripts developed by Schwab's chosen actors, as if we were watching a Broadway play. But with Schwab's scripts, the fiction becomes reality. If you're wondering how these new standards are going to be developed, don't worry. They'll be developed by the experts. Communities of professionals are essential for establishing the right standards, especially standards that reflect a consensus of values and stakeholder priorities. The IEEE, for example, draws on 423,000 members to build consensus among organizations and deliver safety, reliability, and interoperability in a range of electrical and digital systems. Their guidelines for AI shows that they are thinking They are thinking through the broad impact of technologies and not just focusing on the technical requirements or compliance. Is it becoming clear there's never going to be an actual vote? Instead, there's going to be a managed discussion with a predetermined outcome, amendable to that of Schwab and his Davos friends. In his advice for governments, Schwab tells governments they must adopt agile governance, which he defines as an essential strategy to adapt how policies are generated, deliberated, enacted, and enforced to create better governance outcomes in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Inspired by the Agile Manifesto and a report by the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the future of software and society, the concept of agile governance seeks to match the nimbleness, fluidity, flexibility, and adaptiveness of the technologies themselves and the private sector actors adopting them. Just in case you wonder what all that means. It means that Schwab wants to act with all of the ethics of our largest corporations who have polluted our air and water, the pharmaceutical companies who clamor for complete financial immunity for their vaccines, and the big tech who never seem to suffer for violating American values of free speech and free competition. Schwab goes on to detail what some of these models might look like when he writes, encouraging collaborations between governments and businesses to create developtory sandboxes and experimental test beds to develop regulations using iterative, cross-sectoral, and flexible approaches as discussed by Jeff Mulgan, promoting the development of ecosystems of private regulators competing in markets to deliver governance in line with overarching social goals as proposed by Gillian Hadfield in Rules for a Flat World. These proposals are a blueprint for disaster. If liberals of the 1970s were terrified of the power of the intelligence agencies, the defense industry, and big business, those concerns were nothing compared to the corporate-based power world envisioned by Schwab. I'm not sure any filmmaker or writer has adequately captured the dystopian elements of this planned future. The closest comparison I can make is to the Alien movies, in which a corporation partners with the government and bring a monster back to Earth to study its unique biology. This is a genuinely lawless future in which the only justice meted out is that given by powerful corporations. Let's understand the magic show with which Schwab hopes to dazzle the public. He goes into minute and exquisite detail about all the advances in technology and summarizes many of the questions raised by these new technologies. At the same time, we're supposed to be dazzled by these advances. He tells us there are dark undercurrents which these technologies have not addressed. Next, Schwab wants us to believe his rich friends have had nothing to do with the bad parts of our development, and in any case there will be disruptions and new ways of doing things that will forever erase all of these problems. However, to get to that bright future, we're going to have to make some changes. Take off the guardrails, so to speak. Loosen up some of the laws. But don't worry, we'll get some private regulators out there. Discipline will be meted out by trade and professional organizations that won't let you pursue a living if you don't do what they want. And if at the end you still stand up and complain, well, he'll just get big tech to silence you. Where did all these ideas come from? We will investigate that in our next chapter. Chapter 3. Who's responsible for this garbage? There's probably no better expert in the world to address the origins of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Great Reset, than Patrick Wood, an economist by training, author, and lecturer, who has studied the issue of globalization since the 70s. Wood first became interested in the question of powerful groups of elites when, as a young financial analyst and writer, he noticed that upon his election in 1976, President Jimmy Carter picked a number of his advisors from a group called the Trilateral Commission, founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, father of current MSNBC host Micah Brzezinski. In 2016 book Technocracy Rising, Wood recounts the Carter-Brzezinski relationship. President James Earl Carter, the Georgia peanut farmer turned politician who promised, "I will never lie to you," was chosen to join the commission by Brzezinski in 1973. It was Brzezinski, in fact, who first identified Carter as presidential timber and subsequently educated him in economics, foreign policy, and the ins and outs of world politics. Upon Carter's election, his first appointment placed Brzezinski as assistant to the president for national security matters. More commonly, he was called the head of the National Security Council because he only answered to the president. Some rightly said Brzezinski held the second most powerful position in the U.S. That's certainly not a bad position in which to find yourself, second only in power to the President of the United States. Who wouldn't want that gig, especially if it came without the need to do any campaigning? But this didn't happen without decades of prior work, and it certainly began prior to the creation of the Trilateral Commission in 1973. Woods identifies the roots of the globalist movement as beginning with the French philosopher Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, generally credited as being the father of modern sociology and considered the first philosopher of science. In the intellectual ferment of the day, it's easy to understand how he came to believe that scientific knowledge was the only authentic knowledge. This quickly gave rise to what's called Scientism, professing that science alone is what can answer all questions. For those who came to identify as progressives, namely, those who believe human society is evolving toward perfection, this religion of technocrats, dubbed technocracy by its creators, offered a useful path toward the achievement of their utopian dreams, as Wood explains. Industrialization was enabled by science, technology, and invention. As knowledge increased, it was surmised that society must change along with it, or at least adapt to it. Progressives called for bigger government run by qualified managers with diminishing personal liberty and national sovereignty, but they simultaneously fought to reduce waste and increase efficiency in government. The emphasis on efficiency drove many progressives into technocracy, since science appeared to be the only pathway to achieve it. It can then be seen how this new technology might interact with other such ideologies, such as progressivism, socialism, fascism, and even capitalism. The scientists and engineers would then be in control of society, but without having to contend with the pesky problems of democracy and individual rights. When I speak of democracy, my readers understand I'm not talking about a pure democracy, but our constitutional republic a system of majority rule and minority rights, in which elected representatives are given authority to make decisions that they must defend at the next election if they wish to remain in office. Wood goes on to claim that many groups in history, such as the Nazis, fascists, and communists, would adopt many of these principles but were unwilling to allow the growth of a scientific elite leadership class who would oversee the society. These groups may have been evil, but they understood a challenge to their authority when they saw it. Because of its open and democratic institutions, the West seemed to present the best opportunity for the creation of this scientific engineering elite or technocracy. The people simply had to be persuaded to accept this gentle tyranny, which would, of course, free them from all their worries. The colossal death toll of World War I, with more than 9 million dead, should have presented an enormous opportunity for the development of a technocratic state, but those brief dreams were dashed by the technological and social changes brought about by the war, which came to fruition with the Roaring Twenties. During the early part of the 20th century, the technocracy flame was further developed and kept alive by people like Frederick Taylor, an American mechanical engineer best known for his work The Principles of Scientific Management, and Walter Rothenstruck, a professor at Columbia University. Many of these ideas would be embraced by a group of intellectuals who broke away from Columbia to form what became known as the New School, led by two men, Thorstein Veblen and his young protege Howard Scott, in 1921. Veblen released his grand masterpiece, a book entitled Engineers and the Price System, in which he wrote, "If the country's product industry were competently organized as a systematic whole and were then managed by competent technicians with an eye to maximum production of goods and services instead of, as now, being manhandled by ignorant businessmen with an eye single to maximum profits, the result output of goods and services would doubtless exceed the current output by several 100%. It was only with the arrival of the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression in the United States that an opportunity arose for the technocrats, as Wood recounts. Society was ripe for technocracy during the depths of the Great Depression. It certainly appeared that capitalism was dead. Joblessness, deflation, hunger, anger at politicians and capitalists, and other social stresses had people begging for an explanation as to what went wrong and what could be done to fix it. Technocracy Inc. had both capitalism had Technocracy Inc. had both. Capitalism had died a natural death, and a technocracy-oriented society would save them. The engineers, scientists, and technicians who would operate this technocratic utopia would eliminate all waste and corruption. People would only have to work 20 hours per week, and every person would have a job. Abundance would be everywhere. The moment of the technocrats had seemingly arrived. The carnage of millions dying in a world war was not enough, but surely the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, would be talked into such a scheme. Roosevelt did adopt some of their ideas, like suspending the gold standard, confiscating the gold of private citizens, and nationalizing certain industries. But he didn't want to hand power over to the technocrats, as Wood explains. In any case, American democracy was found to be unwilling to entertain technocracy, and it was soundly repudiated for all of these reasons. National sovereignty and the constitutional form of government were not dispensable. Nobody was willing to give up private property or the possibility of accumulating private wealth. The apparent similarities between Technocracy Inc. and Nazi fascism were abhorrent to most Americans. The grandiose promises of technocracy were seen as so much free lunch, and toward the end of the Great Depression, everybody knew from experience that there was no such thing. According to Wood, the technocrats didn't get their way during the Great Depression or World War II. However, in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazi Germany, some of their best scientists and engineers came to America by way of a CIA program called Operation Paperclip, infiltrating our pharmaceutical, defense, and space industries, led most notably by former Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, widely credited for heading the American program to put a man on the moon. The technocrats didn't win the battle for public opinion, but even the Nazi technocrats were able to find a home in American industry and government work. The monster of technocracy slumbered in the American nation, waiting for the opportunity to rise and seize power. Patrick Wood was kind enough to give an interview to me, as he has now been lecturing about the dangers of the technocracy for more than 40 years. He's a tall, distinguished-looking man with a full head of white hair and closely cropped beard, usually dressed in a suit and tie, and reminds me of a distinguished college professor. This should not come as much of a surprise, considering that his longtime collaborator in this research was Dr. Anthony Sutton, a former economics professor at Stanford University and member of the Hoover Institute for War, Peace, and Revolution. Sutton was jokingly referred to by his colleagues as the Hoover vacuum cleaner on account of his voracious appetite for details. Wood's interest in technocracy began shortly after the 1976 presidential election of Jimmy Carter and his Vice President Walter Mondale. As a young financial analyst and writer, I carefully followed Carter's initial round of appointees to the top positions in his cabinet and other important posts. After all, Carter had made a big campaign pitch about being an establishment outsider, with few contacts with the Beltway. Who would he bring to the table? As the list of appointees piled up, I noticed that several were members of the Trilateral Commission, whatever that was, and my curiosity was immediately piqued. After digging up and sifting through a list of Trilateral Commission members and seeing over a dozen Trilateral appointees, it becomes immediately obvious that some sort of coup was underway, but what? In our interview, I began by asking him to explain the role played by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's patron, Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, as well as the contribution of David Rockefeller, who seemed to be the financial dynamo behind the modern-day origins of this technocracy. I also asked about the Trilateral Commission and its subsequent evolution into the World Economic Forum created by Klaus Schwab and his designation of the Fourth Industrial Revolution / Great Reset. Let's start with the Trilateral Commission, founded in 1973. That was the beginning of modern globalization. What happened in the years before 1973 was largely unsuccessful, and the global elite knew that. So they embarked on a new mission with the Trilateral Commission to essentially do an end run around national sovereignty around the world, and to create what they called a new international economic order. That was their marching orders. It was created by David Rockefeller, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and from the Rockefeller oil dynasty. The other founder was a political scientist from Columbia University named Zbigniew Brzezinski. The two of them founded the Trilateral Commission. The significance of Brzezinski being at Columbia University is that he was aware of what technocracy was because that's where it was developed in the early 1930s. Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages: America's Role in the Technotronic Era. Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages: America's Role in the Technotronic Era. That book foretold the technotronic era we're living in today. The book endeared him to David Rockefeller, who was looking for a way to extend his monopoly power by capturing the resources of the world. The outlines of the story Patrick Wood told were clear and easy to follow. This technocracy ideal, a world run by engineers and scientists, was essentially developed in the late 19th century and found an academic home at Columbia University in the 1930s. The philosophy did not sway Franklin Roosevelt, but did sway Adolf Hitler, who depended not on politicians but scientists and engineers to run his Third Reich. Brzezinski further developed these ideas in his book, which caught the attention of David Rockefeller. The technocrats then saw an opportunity to rebrand their philosophy, and within a few short years had captured the presidency with the election of Jimmy Carter and his new National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. I think it's important to understand that technocracy can't accurately be called communism or democracy. It is best understood as a monopoly on power held jointly by big business and big government. And in all honesty, while big government may hold the club, the real power lies with the financial strength of big business. The robber barons of old, like the Rockefellers, weren't interested in a vibrant free market. They didn't like unions, and their perfect world was the company town where the residents owned little and were dependent on the company for practically everything. The robber barons were interested in a closed market, a monopoly, or what might look to the public like relatively few players, when in truth the same group of powerful individuals controlled all the various entities. Wood continued with his explanation of the formation of the Trilateral Commission, the role of President Jimmy Carter, the participation of the United Nations, and the rise of China as an experimental laboratory for this technocratic ideal. The two of them, Rockefeller and Brzezinski, found the Trilateral Commission. This new international economic order then immediately passed the baton to the United Nations. In 1974, the United Nations passed a resolution called the Establishment of a New International Economic Order, with their language, and that's where it was introduced to the United Nations. From 1973 on, many things happened, specifically with China. In 1976, when Jimmy Carter was elected and when Zbigniew Brzezinski became his national security advisor, and both Carter and his vice president, Walter Mondale, were members of the Trilateral Commission, Brzezinski is the one who is credited with bringing Deng Xiaoping to the United States to wine and dine him and bring him back into the global economic fold. This is widely acknowledged in textbooks that Brzezinski was the brains behind the introduction of China to the world stage. Henry Kissinger also had a big hand in that. Kissinger was also a founding member of the Trilateral Commission. According to Wood, the members of the Trilateral Commission had sufficient contacts among the foreign policy elite that they could reasonably expect to be placed in the top positions of government, regardless of whether there was a Republican or Democratic administration in power. President Nixon, a Republican, had Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor, and Democrat Jimmy Carter had Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor and confidant. The technocrats finally reached the center of American power in the 1970s after more than 40 years of effort and could begin putting their plans into action, starting with a test for their ambitions. Their choice? Not the United States, where they knew they'd run into predictable opposition. Instead, the technocrats chose China, as Wood explained. China looked like North Korea does today. They had no economic system, there was starvation, they had no industry, and it was horrible. Oppressive culture. However, it was a blank slate to anything that the Rockefeller crowd wanted done. When Zbigniew Brzezinski got a hold of Deng Xiaoping, Brzezinski did not teach China about free market economics or capitalism. He taught them about technocracy. That's one reason the ascendance of China has been so dramatic. They have excelled at using that, exploiting it, expanding it, and exporting it to the world. China is the poster child for technocracy. They have perfected surveillance, artificial intelligence, and the use of social credit scores to keep their citizens in line, and strong-arming the population, forcing them to do whatever they want. If they don't comply willingly, they just start shooting them. That is basically the story of China and how it came to where it is today. Wood's presentation of the history was so succinct and provided me with such a different lens with which to view the rise of China. It was momentarily disorienting. Had such a close relationship existed between the Chinese Communist Party and the technocrats since the 1970s? Was a significant part of our foreign policy establishment working with the Chinese Communist Party since the late 70s? However, a publicly available text of the first exchange between Zbigniew Brzezinski and Deng Xiaoping on May 21st, 1978, currently exists on the website of the U.S.-China Institute. It seems that Brzezinski was so interested in normalizing the relationship with China that he didn't mind selling out the people of Taiwan or concealing what he was doing from the American people. Brzezinski, with respect to discussions about normalization, which we trust will begin in June, I would like to suggest that these discussions be kept confidential and that no advanced publicity be issued. I think continuing such discussions in the context of confidentiality would make their success more likely and would minimize some of the political complications which, at one point or another, will be inevitable in our own country. Although my visit here is not to negotiate normalization, I would like to think of it as contributing a step forward and not a step backward. We only want to go forward, and I hope you will interpret this visit in such a fashion. We start with the premise, which we have already accepted before, that there is only one China and 1.5 Chinas or 2 Chinas or China and Taiwan. For us, there is only one China. We also believe that the 3 key points provide the framework for defining our basic relationship. There are certain basic difficulties that we ourselves have to overcome, but though these difficulties are for us to overcome precisely because there is a relationship between us, you have to be aware of these difficulties and be sensitive to them. The fundamental difficulty is how will the American people understand the nature of this historically transitional period in our relations with the people of Taiwan following normalization. During that historical During that historically transitional period, domestic difficulties in the U.S. would be far minimized if our hope and expectation that the internal and purely domestic resolution of Chinese problems would be such that it would be peaceful and that our own hopes in this respect would not be specifically contradicted. One doesn't need to be a diplomat to understand when you're being betrayed. Brzezinski was clearly throwing Taiwan overboard in favor of China, and in return Brzezinski seemed to be begging the Chinese not to do anything that would unduly harm the wary American public. It seems both sides understood the bargain they were making. As one reads the account, it's difficult to escape the feeling that Brzezinski was acting like the diplomat of a subservient nation, while China was being treated as the dominant nation, perhaps even the victor of a great war. Brzezinski remained a friend to the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party all his life, and when he died in June 2017, was remembered fondly in the pages of China Daily in an opinion piece titled "Brzezinski and His Insightful Wisdom Will Be Missed." Here's a sample of what they wrote. The passing of Zbigniew Brzezinski last week came as a shock because a little more than a month ago he was still making public appearances and commenting on the Korean Peninsula issue. In the past week, many of my Chinese journalist friends who had interviewed him or attended his lecture recalled on WeChat moments their fond memories of the great strategist. For many of us, Brzezinski was a man of wisdom with a great understanding of the world and China. As the U.S. National Security Advisor in the Jimmy Carter administration, Brzezinski played a key role in the normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China in 1979. To my generation, Brzezinski was one of several wise U.S. politicians known to Chinese. Others included former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and former U.S. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. When you're eulogized by the Chinese Communist Party, I question when you reach the pearly gates if you're going to get a good reception from St. Peter. I don't think you're going to the good place with fluffy clouds and angels playing music. More likely, you're going to spend eternity in a much warmer climate. Wood continued with the history of how the technocrats once established in government figured out how to remain in powerful positions. The early members of the Trilateral Commission told us repeatedly that they were not interested in a political takeover, and yet during the Carter administration, Carter and Mondale were members, Brzezinski was a member, and at one point, every cabinet member Carter had, except for one, was a member of the Trilateral Commission. It looked like a clean sweep. Then, on the other hand, they say they're not interested in a political takeover. They just wanted to create a new international economic order. But what we found out was that America represented the policy-generating strongman of global economics, and anybody who could get their hands on the engine of economics would be able to control the entire planet. And that's exactly what they did as time went onwards from 1976. The narrative of Patrick Wood conforms to the known facts about the early Trilateral Commission and China's entry into the global economic community. These were not low-level government employees. They were the top officials of our government, and they were enacting plans they'd never discussed among the American public. However, they had to work slowly, as they did not want the support of the voters for many of these initiatives. However, they had to work slowly, as they did not have the support of the voters for many of these initiatives. They would need to be present in every presidential administration going forward, as Wood detailed the various administrations. These technocrats had represented left and right, liberal and conservative. The political labels mean nothing to them. They operated through the Reagan administration, the George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was a member of the Trilateral Commission. Then you had Bill Clinton and Al Gore, both of whom were members of the Trilateral Commission. They brought into their government many members of the Trilateral Commission. Then with George W. Bush, you had Dick Cheney, who was a powerful member of the Trilateral Commission. Then you had Obama, who was completely surrounded in his intelligence community by members of the Trilateral Commission. Completely surrounded. The same thing happened, maybe to a lesser extent, in the Trump administration. And now you have the Biden administration. In the interview, Wood went on to tell a curious story about Henry Kissinger simply showing up at the White House and having at least 2 unscheduled meetings with President Trump. This is highly irregular, as meetings are supposed to be scheduled on the daily agenda, and yet it testifies to Kissinger's continuing influence more than 40 years after he left the White House, despite not being able to set foot in several countries around the world who have designated him a war criminal for his actions during the Vietnam War. And what may or may not have been a coincidence, one of these times was right after Trump was fired. In what may or may not have been a coincidence, one of these times was right after Trump had fired FBI Director James Comey, as reported by Chris Cillizza of CNN. The White House press pool was called into the Oval Office just before noon Eastern Time for what they expected to be a photo op between Trump and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, since the two men were scheduled to huddle earlier today. But it wasn't Lavrov they found sitting with the president. It was Henry Kissinger, best known for his role as Secretary of State to President Nixon. Reporters asked Trump about the firing of FBI Director James Comey. Trump responded briefly that Comey was simply not doing a good job. It was apparently lost on Trump that the last 16 hours had been dominated by comparisons between Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre, where he jettisoned the independent counsel investigating Watergate, and Trump's decision to part ways with Comey. Cillizza of CNN claimed that Kissinger's unexpected appearance was just another example of the Trump circus, a whirlwind of incompetence, just a step or two away from disaster. And yet, given what was going on with Trump and the former FBI director, who had just been fired not 24 hours earlier, another interpretation based on the decades of work by Patrick Wood was plausible. Trump was showing his independence by firing FBI Director Comey, and perhaps Kissinger went in to deliver a threat from the globalists. Kissinger may have thought it would be a secret meeting, but Trump turned that situation around by inviting the press in for a photo opportunity. Kissinger, well into his 90s, couldn't quickly scurry away, but instead sat in his chair looking like nothing more than a shriveled little troll as the press arrived. I defy you to look at the picture and come to any conclusion. Trump ended his term, maybe just the first, as a, as combative as when he entered, although he had not done much to harm the globalists or halt their march to a technocratic state. I asked Patrick Wood I asked Patrick Wood to explain how the Trilateral Commission fed into the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset, and as usual, he had a clear and concise answer. Back in the early days of the Trilateral Commission, they were very reticent to come out and speak about their plans. They did it every once in a while, but we beat them up so badly they decided not to come out and play anymore. They were relatively secretive about their plans and operations. Even David Rockefeller, in his memoirs, admitted that they were very secretive about their meetings and plans. By comparison, the World Economic Forum is made up of the same type of people as the Trilateral Commission, but